Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. It is on governing amidst the COVID pandemic, and it is with Peter Beinart. My name is Chris Marty. You've all seen me on these webinars before. Before we get started, a couple of things I want to remind everybody of. Number one, you are muted and you will remain muted throughout this discussion and presentation. That's just to eliminate all the background noise. Your camera's turned off, likewise, and for the same reason. You do have the opportunity to submit questions to Peter as we go along here, and I would encourage you to do that as soon as you think of them, so that A, you don't forget, and B, we can address your questions, because that is our preferred course of action once we get to our Q&A session. So, all that being said, I'd like now to introduce Peter Beinart. Peter is one of America's most highly regarded commentators on American politics and foreign policy. He's a Rhodes Scholar. He is a professor of journalism and political science at the City University of New York, a senior fellow at the Foundation for Middle East Peace, an editor-at-large for Jewish Currents, a contributor to The Atlantic, and a political commentator for CNN. So Peter, all that being said, thank you for being here and welcome. We're all interested in what you have to say today.
Thanks, Chris. It's really a pleasure to be with you. It's been a pleasure kind of getting to know you a bit over the past few weeks. I've really enjoyed it. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about how COVID is changing American politics, and then really happy to have kind of a conversation with all of you. If I had to summarize it in one sentence, the impact that COVID is having on American politics, I would say it's making everyone and everything an even more extreme version of what they already were. I'm going to try to kind of explain how that's playing itself out. So let me just start with the election. What impact is COVID having on the election? The first, if you look at the polling, you know, and you go back to when COVID hit. When COVID hit, Biden's lead over Trump in head-to-head matchup was around 4 points, maybe 5 points. In June, it expands up to about 7 points, and it's been pretty steady since then. It's been one of the more steady races that we've seen in presidential campaigns in terms of head-to-head matchup. Trump's opinion favorable rating has also been very, very steady, basically within a small band in generally from the low to at its high point in the mid 40s. So why does Biden's lead seem to go up a little bit starting in the kind of early summer? And what might COVID have to do with that? I think there's several different explanations one might offer. One is that when COVID hit, what you saw was that leaders around the world and in the United States, governors, for instance, all saw their popularity ratings go up initially. There was what sometimes called a kind of rally around the flag effect that you sometimes have when there's a kind of national trauma that people kind of want to believe in their leaders and support them. And that may have kept Trump's kind of within range of Biden in those first months. But then after that faded a bit, and you saw this not only for Trump, but for some other world leaders, that Trump's support, the polling on how Trump was handling COVID started to look not very good. And that may help to explain why Biden started to kind of pull out to that lead that he has maintained. Another explanation for why COVID may have helped Biden is that it made it harder for Trump to essentially focus people's attention on how bad Biden was, because Americans were so focused on the COVID crisis and on the economic crisis. If you think about the strategy that previous incumbents have used, let's look at, for instance, George H.W. Bush with Michael Dukakis in 1988, or Barack Obama with Mitt Romney in 2012. Often what you see is once the opposing party has figured out who their nominee is, the incumbent basically barrages that the airwaves in an effort to kind of negatively define that person before they're very well known to the public at large, to drive up their negatives. But Trump was not really very successful in doing that. Biden is not particularly beloved by Americans. He doesn't have a hugely passionate, devoted supporters, but his negatives are not nearly as high as Hillary Clinton's were. And it may be that one of the Trump administration's effort to focus people on their negatives, on Biden's negatives, was impaired by the fact that everyone was so focused on COVID in those first few months. Another explanation for why Biden starts to move out to that lead in June is also that you start to see the real economic suffering that emerges as a result of COVID. One of the interesting things, if you look at the polling, is that Trump still has an advantage on the economy. If you ask people to kind of say, what do you prefer, Biden and Trump over, the economy is actually still the thing where Trump does best. But the advantage is not as great as it was before COVID. And the messaging, of course, is a little more complicated. Instead of simply saying, as Trump was saying before COVID, I've created the best economy ever, aren't you doing better than you were 4 years ago? He now has to make the more convoluted argument that I had created this amazing economy, then this COVID thing came out of China, but you can trust me to do it again because I've done it once, right? It's just not as simple. It's not as simple an argument. A third explanation for why you start to see this shift in early summer, maybe that it wasn't about COVID at all. If you remember, George Floyd's death was on May 25th, and then you have the protests that emerge afterwards. The polling suggests that Trump didn't get high marks in his response to those racial protests, and that Biden is seen as kind of more empathetic and more unifying on racial questions. More recently, Trump has tried to focus a lot on law and order and on violence in these protests, but there's not really a lot of evidence that we can see that has really helped him very much. Again, it's one thing to essentially say that the country's, that chaos is breaking out, that there's anarchy, there's violence, it's going to help, heck in a handbasket when you're not president, when it's on the other guy's watch. But again, the argument for Trump is a little more complicated. He basically has to say, these Democratic governors and mayors are responsible for all of this violence and chaos. And if Biden gets in, it'll be even worse because he'll be beholden to them. But of course, he's still the president, right? So no matter what's happening, even if it's in a Democratic state or city, it's more difficult. People sometimes have compared Trump's law and order message to Richard Nixon's in 1968, for instance. But there is a critical difference, which was Nixon was not president. And so he didn't have to bear ownership over the bad things that he was talking about. One demographic where I think COVID has probably had the most significant impact, I would say, is among older voters. Hillary Clinton did terribly among older voters in 2016, and Biden is doing much better. And I think it's a plausible hypothesis that older voters are more concerned about COVID than younger voters, and they don't overall think that Trump is doing a great job. And so even though older voters in general tend to be more conservative and have been very Republican leaning in recent decades, that Biden has cut into Trump's support among them because of COVID. And that's really, really important for Biden, because there are real questions about whether Biden will be able to generate the kind of turnout among young people that, for instance, that Barack Obama did. He had very little support among young people in the primaries, for instance. As I said, there are real questions about how solid and passionate his support is among younger voters, among Latino voters. But older voters historically have turned out at higher rates than younger voters. They're dependable voters, and they're particularly disproportionately well represented in some key states like Florida and Pennsylvania and Arizona, which is going to be a key state. So Biden, if to the degree COVID has helped Biden in those states, that's something that's pretty valuable to him. It's also possible that COVID has helped Biden because it has made it harder to have big rallies. Trump has had a few big rallies, but it's been a little more complicated because he's gotten a certain amount of criticism for doing that from people who say that it's a health risk. And he certainly, for a period of time there in the summer, he wasn't doing them at all. And as you know, Trump is able to generate huge, big, raucous rallies, right? For Biden, who's not able to generate the same kind of big, raucous rally, the fact that he in some ways has this alibi, which is to say, well, I don't want to hold these rallies anyway because it's dangerous, in some way is kind of letting him off the hook, which I think has been helpful. On the other hand, one of the things that's interesting about the two ways the two parties have handled this is the Republicans have been much more willing to go door to door and do in-person canvassing over the past few months than the Democrats have. right? The Democrats have kind of taken the view, you know, that if they're seen as quote unquote responsible, you know, you always see Biden with the mask everywhere, that will redound to their benefit. So they've been doing a lot of phone banking. Republicans have been doing much more door-to-door in-person canvassing. There has been some grumbling from some Democrats that is good, that could really hurt them, that the phone banking is much less effective than going door to door, and that it may ultimately turn out that that was a way in which COVID ultimately really could hurt Biden, because it led them to give up a tool of canvassing, which actually may turn out to be to the Republicans' advantage. Finally, the last thing to say about the election is, obviously, COVID is having a big effect on the way people vote. It's leading more people to vote absentee, but in particular, it's leading Democrats to vote absentee. As Trump has raised questions about absentee voting, you've started to see this big bifurcation in Democrats saying they're going to vote absentee and Republicans saying they're going to vote in person. And the data seems to suggest that Democrats are requesting a lot more absentee ballots than Republicans have. And how this is going to turn out is a very, very big question. In normal times, absentee ballots are thrown out at a significantly higher rate than regular ballots. Because you just think about it, you go into the poll, and let's say you're about to write your name in the wrong place, or make some kind of mistake. The poll worker is there; they can correct you. You can potentially correct it. If you're in your home, right? And you make some kind of mistake, you write your name in the wrong place, you forget to sign it, you'll give abbreviation of your name, which is not your full name, you put an address, which is not exactly the same, right? Absentee ballots get thrown out at higher rates. It's also the case that we've never had nearly this number of absentee ballots. So the capacity of the system to actually count these absentee ballots in a timely fashion is a super, super big question. Totally possible that what you could end up with is if you're unfortunate enough to remember what happened in 2000, right? When you had basically all of these lawyers, Democratic lawyers, Republican lawyers, sitting in a room looking at ballots in Florida, looking for the hanging chads, right? Seeing if they had punched the punch through all the way through. You could potentially have that with absentee ballots in multiple states on a mass scale, going on for days, very likely weeks, and going to court over what the criteria are by which you judge all of these things. One of the things that Democrats are super worried about is that Trump takes an early lead because more Republicans vote in person. And that then Trump says, well, the absentee ballots are fraudulent. So essentially, I declare victory. It's over. And the Republicans move to stop all those counts. Then it will probably end up in the courts. The courts move slowly. By early December, the states have to start certifying these electors remember, the way our system works is the states choose these electors, either a Republican state or a Democratic slate of electors, and they cast the ballots, right? But let's say it's still in the courts. The count is not finished. It is within the power of state legislatures to go ahead and simply appoint the slate of electors themselves. A Democratic governor in some states, you've got some of these key states where you have Democratic governor, Republican state legislature. You could have two rival slates of electors being presented to Congress. You could have one slate that the Democrats see as illegitimate or vice versa. And this is, ladies and gentlemen, a constitutional crisis in which ultimately it ends up in the lap of the House and Senate. We can talk a little more about what might ultimately happen, but I think that more than COVID being pro-Biden or pro-Trump, I think the fairest thing you can say about its electoral impact is it's pro-chaos. It increases the chances of chaos. So let me say something about how Biden and Trump might govern. Again, it's made them both a more extreme version of themselves. Biden was already moving to the left because the Democratic Party base is to the left, and especially younger Democrats, right? Older Democrats tend to be kind of like Bill Clinton, Barack Obama liberals. Young Democrats tend to be socialists. They mostly voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary, and Biden knows that he has to give them a reason to appeal to him. He was already likely to do that, but COVID has created a new urgency and a kind of a new sense of opportunity. Democrats are now very enamored of the Franklin Delano Roosevelt, New Deal Depression analogy. It's like 1993. The pandemic and the economic crisis have shown that the system is broken, and it's given us an opportunity for big, massive change, kind of massive new stimulus program to rebuild America's infrastructure and healthcare system and to try to make it all much more green, to battle climate change, to deal with the economic suffering of people, and also put the US on a kind of fundamentally new kind of environmental and economic footing. The clearest way you can see this new mood, which was happening before COVID but has been accelerated by COVID, I would say, is in the changing discussion on the question of the filibuster, right? Because you could have your big ideas no matter what, but the reality is if you need 60 votes in the Senate, which the Democrats won't have anywhere near close to having, even if they win the Senate, you're not going to be able to get something that big through. And you've seen a growing number of Democratic senators since COVID hit saying that they're willing to overturn the filibuster, which would mean that they would only need 51 votes. And though even Biden is by his nature a kind of an incremental, kind of like a bit of a 3 yards in a cloud of dust kind of guy, you can see that he's shifting because of this broader shift in the party. And one thing that's important to remember when you think about Biden and how he would interact with his base as president is he would not be a president like Bill Clinton or Barack Obama or Ronald Reagan or Donald Trump, who had a very strong visceral relation to his party's base. Democratic activists, progressive activists don't love Joe Biden. They can tolerate Joe Biden. It's much more like the relationship that George H.W. Bush had to his party's base. He's not really one of them. And he's going to face two senators, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, who are both more beloved by the party's base than him. He's going to face pressure from his left in Congress in a way that most Democrats have not, and in a way that most Republicans don't face from their right. And I think that you already see him moving because of that different reality. On the Republican side, again, I think the dynamic is similar. It's not that if COVID is pushing Democrats left, it's making the Republican Party more nationalistic. If you think about 2000, the Republican Party is at its core in some ways a nationalistic party. It's prone to focus on adversaries and threats that seem to threaten American well-being and American honor, American pride. In 2016, Trump focused a lot on Mexico. And of course, and he also focused on ISIS, right? Remember, jihadist terrorism was a much bigger issue in 2015, 2016 than it is today. Today, it's really China that has taken center stage as that kind of core threat that activates Republican Party nationalism. And that was already happening before COVID, but COVID has accentuated it. The core narrative, which is essentially that China is responsible for this plague that's hit the United States. And it's given more ammunition to Republicans who say, we need a wholesale decoupling from China. We cannot be reliant on China for critical materials, for critical technology. We have to we have to basically break this dependence that we have on China. And I think that if Trump is reelected, he will push that even further than he has today. Maybe, for instance, leaving the World Trade Organization, I think might be one possibility. And even if Trump doesn't win, if you look at the rising group of Republicans who might emerge in his wake, Tom Cotton, Marco Rubio, Missouri Senator Josh Hawley, Ted Cruz, they're talking a ton about China and about basically a kind of a new Cold War vision in which the United States protects itself against China, delinks from China. And I think that COVID has accentuated that. And I guess I'll just end by saying, COVID has been a national trauma, right? It and the economic effects have produced a great deal of suffering and fear and rage and despair. I think it's also made a lot of people, regardless of their party, less confident in America. There's a greater sense, again, regardless of your politics, that the death and the mass unemployment and the street violence and the potential of a chaotic election have made people feel like the country is falling apart. And my fear is that no matter who wins next January, that a lot of Americans are going to see this government as an alien occupying force. Everybody likes to believe that when in the United States, when the going gets tough, that we come together, that we rally together. But the harsh truth is that in a country, as in a family, pain doesn't always bring people together. Sometimes pain drives people apart and leads them to turn on one another. And sadly and tragically, I feel like that's what seems to be happening in America right now. So I'll stop with that.
My response, Peter, is wow. What a place to stop. I have a lot of questions. We don't have any from the audience yet. I hope they'll ask some, but you mentioned what happens if we go through November 3rd, maybe November 4th, maybe the 5th, and we end up with a real chaotic kind of non-result for the election.
Yeah.
And it ends up in the courts, but ultimately, is that the only place it goes? What are the institutional processes or constitutional processes in place that allow this country to decide an election that can't be decided with a popular vote for whatever reason?
Right. You know, there are, I think, 3 institutions to watch. The first is the courts, and at first you'll have the lower courts, because the questions will be, what are the rules under which these ballots are going to be counted? You know, the problem is that, again, as we've seen with COVID, is exposed, our infrastructure is really rickety, right? In New York, where I live, they reported today that the state has sent out all of these erroneous absentee ballots, right? And so there'd be a lot of places where there just may be incompetence or inability to actually deal with the issues. We saw in some congressional races that it took, in New York, for instance, this summer, that it took weeks for them to get a result, right? So you're going to have probably something which is going to drag on for a long time. It'll depend, I think, in terms of the optics, who looks to be ahead will matter a lot. The courts will have to intervene. The question may be, though, that it does not get settled by the time you need to choose electors, which is in early December. And then you may move from state courts to state legislatures really playing a crucial role. Do they go ahead? I mean, one of the crazy things about our system, you know, which people don't focus a lot on, is the Constitution. All the Constitution says is that the state legislatures need to choose electors. It doesn't even say that the people need to vote. In the 19th century, you had states in which state legislatures just chose slates of electors who then voted for the presidential candidate, right? So the state legislatures have a lot of leeway. But they could choose slates that are very contested. Even a lot. What's good, the Republicans are in a strong position because they control a lot of the state legislatures in key states. But Democrats control several key governorships. So you could have Republican, let's say, legislatures passing a group of electors, vetoing it by the governor, who appoints his own set of electors. Then ultimately it moves from there into Congress. One of the really important things to watch will be, do Democrats take the Senate? Can they certify that? If they certify that Democrats control the Senate, Democrats then control both houses of Congress, which would put them in a strong position to certify or not certify various states of electors. If that doesn't happen, Republicans still control the Senate, then Mike Pence will be presiding over the Senate. And so the Republicans then will have a lot of leeway to control what the Senate does, but Nancy Pelosi probably will still control the House. So this is, to use, I think I can say this because they said this on CNN last night. So apologies to any children in the audience, a shit show, right? And I haven't even mentioned the possibility of what happens if people take this to the streets, right? I mean, you could have weeks of this process in which people start to go out into the streets, and there's a lot of reason to worry.
Yeah. So given all of that, my next question to follow on is this what it takes to generate some kind of election reform that eliminates all this potential uncertainty, all of the administrative kinds of potentials that you just described in the various states, in Congress. I mean, it compared to other developed nations, it would appear that we have a rather uncertain and ill-defined electoral system.
Yes, absolutely right. It's actually quite interesting. You know, there are international election monitors that have been monitoring American elections since 2002. They come from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And I was actually, just for something I've been writing, I was looking at the reports they've done. And so, yes, one of the things is that most countries do not have the same federal system we have. So in most countries, you have some national authority that sets standards. We, for better or for worse, also in education and many others, we devolve a lot of power down to states and localities to run things themselves. So that means that you have a huge amount of variety. That's not all bad, right? I mean, let's say you're a Democrat, right? You might be really happy that Donald Trump doesn't have control over all of the local election systems, right? Because you don't know what he's going to do, right? So it's some ways it's a safety valve, right? Because it diffuses power from both parties, but it means that you don't have a uniform set. You also have the problem that both parties are seeing these potential changes, not primarily through they're saying that they want for what's best for the country, but basically they're seeing it through the lens of what's good for them, right? And there is this strong belief right now, I hope it doesn't continue, but that basically Democrats basically believe essentially the easier you make it to vote, the better it is for us.
Right.
Republicans basically believe the easier you make it to, and Trump has said this, the easier you make it to vote, the worse it is for us. Now, Democrats cloak that in the language of voter access, the right to vote. Republicans cloak it in the language of voter fraud. But it's basically about, is this good for me? And so until you can kind of have a situation in which people can say, can put that aside, or at least not be so certain about what the effect is, it's really hard to get a consensus. If Biden wins, and if the Democrats take the Senate, and if they abolish the filibuster, they may well pass what I think is called the Democracy Act or something like this. It's already in Congress, which would make voting easier, allow same-day registration, change the rules for gerrymandering. So that potentially could happen, but it's not going to be something Republicans are going to probably be happy about. They're going to see it as basically Democrats changing the rules in order to make sure they win.
Yeah, you mentioned something that we have a question about that actually, in terms of what Harry Reid did a few years ago,
yes.
What's called the nuclear option, right?
Yes.
In the Senate, constitutionally, was intended to be very different than the House of Representatives.
Right.
And the rules are different, and they have been for a long time.
Right.
And what do you think the risk is of allowing the Senate rules? Now, I understand some of these aren't constitutional. They're historical, they're precedent-based, but allowing the Senate and the House to become essentially two houses of representatives where a flat majority wins in every case, what is the long-term implication of that?
Well, I think, that it moves us to a situation which is more like a parliamentary system. In a parliamentary system, you don't have a separation of power. So if you win the election, your prime minister is the head of the legislative body, and basically people tend to vote along party lines, and you can get more done. Our system is not designed to be that way. It's designed to have a separation of powers, and what that means is that basically historically in America, to get big things done, you've had to have buy-in from both parties. The problem is that was a lot easier at a time when the parties were not so ideologically divided. If you go back even a couple of decades, back to the 1980s, the parties are much more ideologically, heterogeneous. You have conservative Southern Democrats. You have modern, even liberal Northern Republicans. I mean, I'm from Massachusetts. I can remember as a kid elections where the Democratic candidate, you had usually a Catholic, socially conservative, anti-abortion Democrat who was often as conservative or more conservative than a culturally liberal Protestant kind of Republican, right? That doesn't exist anymore. And so the reason in some ways that you're seeing this push towards trying to get things done on party lines is because the parties have so much difficulty coming together. Now, And the filibuster, it's true, it's been a deeply entrenched tradition. What critics will say is that there's been a change, which is that the filibuster used to be a real filibuster, which is to say it was hard. You actually had to get up there and read the phone book. What we've had in more recent decades is a virtual filibuster, which is essentially, basically it says I say a filibuster, and then basically you need 60 votes. I think we are in an arms race, as with everything, who started the arms race, right? It's always this kind of chicken and egg question, right? Both Republicans will point to what Democrats did to Robert Bork, Democrats will point to Merrick Garland, right? Everyone has their starting point, but what's certainly clear is that every administration is escalating, and the Democrats are now poised, if they have the capacity, to take another big step in escalating, which would be filibuster. And we have not even talked about changes in the Supreme Court, which the chances of which have now shot up since the choice of Amy Coney Barrett. And we just have there are very, very few people who have influence in the two parties now who basically can stand against these tendencies.
I think the last attempted change to the Supreme Court was FDR, wasn't it?
Yes, and actually it's instructive to look at how that happened, what happened. It's interesting. So what happened was Democrats won a big electoral victory, but a lot of the Supreme Court justices had still been appointed by the more conservative presidents in the 1920s, and they were striking down a lot of New Deal legislation. So you can imagine a somewhat similar situation if Democrats have a big victory, but you've got a lot of these Republican appointees who are on the court, and they start knocking down legislation, the Affordable Care Act, for instance, and other kinds of things. What happened with FDR was that he threatened to pack the court, to basically put on all these new Supreme Court justices to give them a majority. He didn't get it through, but it scared the Supreme Court justices enough that a couple of key votes switched and they started to allow the New Deal through. So one of the things you might be imagining as a Democrat is the threat of this in itself is valuable. We know that John Roberts, for instance, actually, although he's a conservative, is someone who cares a lot about the legitimacy of the court. Now, he himself may not be enough. He could still be outvoted by a 5-seat conservative majority with Barrett on the court, but that there may be the possibility that the court is responsive to public opinion. So the Democrats may be thinking, we want at least the threat of this, even if we can't ultimately get it through.
Interesting. Okay, that is interesting because I don't know what the chances of that would be this time around, but it's interesting to think about.
You don't need it's not in the Constitution that they're 9 seats. So theoretically, you could just do it with Congress and the president's signature.
There's another question from the audience that I actually personally find interesting as well. There's a lot of money flowing into the Biden campaign.
Yeah. And
out there in the electorate and in the media too, you've got a whole group of what are now, I guess, former Republicans who are called Never Trumpers, who are providing people an opportunity to form a sort of silent majority, I guess. Do you think that that's a real phenomenon? How long does that last? And does that give some sort of opportunity to Biden to pull away what used to be loyal Republicans from the Trump campaign?
I mean, the numbers of these Never Trumpers, I think, in aggregate are not that large, right? I mean, if you look at just Trump's approval rating among Republicans, it's very high, right? And we saw that no one was able to mount a serious primary challenge to Trump. A bunch of people tried and they really got nowhere. So Trump has really, I think, taken over the identity, at least temporarily, of the Republican Party. I think the Never Trump phenomenon is more of an elite phenomenon. That doesn't mean it can't matter, right? It can matter, potentially. I think the question was talking about funding. I mean, I haven't looked at this closely, but it is possible that there are big donors. There are also others like the Lincoln Project, for instance, which is run by some prominent former Republican consultants who are basically, they're running their own anti-Trump efforts. And it's interesting to contrast their messaging with the Biden messaging, right? Because it has a particular flavor, right? They'll often say, Ronald Reagan would never have done this kind of thing, I don't think this is going, and it's, some of these suburban women who have moved into the Democratic Party may have been people who were voted for Mitt Romney, let's say, or George W. Bush. So we may see some of this phenomenon. But again, it's important. It's not only a one-way move. So while there are suburban Republican women with college degrees, let's say, who voted for the Bushes and Romney and are now voted, and maybe you're going to vote for Biden, there are Democrats in rural areas, white Democrats in rural areas, maybe without college degrees, who voted for Clinton. Maybe they even voted for Obama, who are now pretty firmly in the kind of Trump kind of category. And so I think in both parties, there's been a bit of a tipping effect.
Interesting. There are a couple of stories that have been floating around, right? And this is historical, but politicians used to have personal relationships with each other, and it often crossed the aisle. So you'd have people cooperating with each other, going to cocktail parties, having dinner. Right. The question in front of me that I'm reading here talks about Orrin Hatch and Ted Kennedy.
Yes.
And that does not appear to us, the random voter out there as being
right.
the case anymore.
Right.
What do you think has led to that kind of extreme bifurcation? And is that just the way it is now? And is it going to continue to be that way?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I think part of it is starting in the 90s, you start to see a bifurcation of the media, right? So if you're talking about Ted Kennedy on Hatch, you're talking about a time when a lot of Republicans and Democrats are still consuming the same media. That starts to fracture with conservative talk radio, and then with Fox News, which is essentially the extension of conservative talk radio onto TV. So you've got this whole group of Republicans who defect away from essentially listening to the same media that Democrats are doing. And then it means that those medias that are left, whether it's CNN or CBS or NBC, the people listening to them are now more liberal, and they naturally move in that direction. So you see MSNBC kind of becoming kind of liberal version of Fox. And then you add social media onto that, right? So you're now basically just looking at your particular curated feed, and if you spend your time listening to conservative media or versus listening to American media, the stories that they cover are completely different. And the picture you get of the country is completely different. And also these mechanisms mean that they give people new ways of communicating with their politicians and forcing their politicians to be responsive. So I think Orrin Hatch and Ted Kennedy also, in some ways, were not as beholden to their party bases as they were. I mean, you can just think about the way social media allows people to kind of barrage you with their opinions about things. That has a big impact. The fear that a Republican might have that they would be denounced by Rush Limbaugh, the fear that a Democrat might have that they would be denounced by a huge bunch of people on Twitter. I think it means that people are more afraid of going against their base than they were. The social compositions of the two parties have also changed, I think, in some ways that I think probably have an interesting impact here, which is to say, the Republican Party has become more a party of white evangelicals and conservative Catholics. If you just look at members of Congress, just look at their demography, and it has remained very male. The Democrats in Congress, compared to the Democratic composition of Congress, let's say 2 or 3 decades ago, is much more female now, much more people of color, and much more secular. So the chances that you will have a Democrat and a Republican who, although they're in different parties, have some other binding connection in ways in which they see themselves as similar, that's less and less the case. And so I think all of these things push against the possibility of people really forging these bonds that allow them to actually really get things done.
We had a speaker about a month ago, Alex Stamos, who used to be the chief security officer for Facebook, I think Yahoo at one point as well. And he's working with Homeland Security on election security. And one of his comments was that because of the nature of our political system, we have to deal, like you said, not with one election authority, but with 50,
Right.
in 50 different ways of counting votes and 50 different systems
Yes.
of counting votes. It seems to me to tie these two concepts together, that you mentioned social media.
Yeah.
We're now in an era where we've got so many ways to communicate with each other and group together. It seems like a similar problem. How do we fix all that? Is it fixable?
I really don't know the answer to how we fix it. I mean, I think that one way of thinking about this issue of what's happening in the United States is that America is a young democracy. Now, we think of America as a very old democracy, right? 1776. But really, up until the 1960s, most African Americans can't really vote. And also, up until the 1960s, you don't have a lot of immigration in the United States. America has this big wave of immigration, late 19th, early 20th century, basically shut off in the early 20s, doesn't really start opening up again until the 1960s. So in a way, you can think about the question of America as a truly multiracial democracy, meaning a democracy in which white people are no longer a clear majority, in which everyone can vote. This is uncharted territory, right? If you think about American democracy from that perspective, we look more like Brazil, a country which only emerged from military dictatorship in the 1960s. We were not a military dictatorship, but we were not a country where everyone can vote. And we were a country in which hierarchies and the homogeneity of the country was much clearer than it is now. And I think these are really, really fundamental questions. I mean, just think about it this way. In terms of the very core question of the identity of the country and how that works demographically. The Democrats moved to make Puerto Rico a state, right? A lot of Americans don't think about this. We have these territories out there, right? Like Puerto Rico, which are in some ways technically part of the United States, but their people can't vote, right? I mean, if you think Republicans already feel, a lot of them, that the country is being taken away from them and that this cultural, imagine what happens if this is a Spanish-speaking population, right? That they basically say, it's colonialism, right? That basically they're under American control, they should become a state. I think this is these are some of the macro questions that we fund. I think where we need to get to, I think, what I desperately hope we get to, is we have two parties, both of which are diverse racially, religiously, but have a different vision, one more progressive, one more conservative, right? That should be possible, right? There are plenty of conservative Latinos and out there. There are plenty of, George W. Bush got 40% of the Latino vote. There are plenty of conservative Asians out there. Asians used to vote Republican in pretty large numbers, right? A group of people that has a whole series of reasons. Latinos can be socially conservative. Asians are often, may not be thrilled with affirmative action policies, which are hurting them. Muslims, up until in the 1990s, tended to vote more Republican than Democratic, and Arab Americans. I think that, where I would hope is that the Republican Party moves to people like Marco Rubio and Nikki Haley and Tim Scott, and you basically have two parties, both of which embrace America's diversity, but have very different visions of how it should play it out policy-wise. What I fear is happening is that the ideological division of the two parties is mapping very closely on to divisions of identity. And I think that's what's making American politics particularly toxic.
Yeah, you mentioned the media, and it appears from the outside, and you're a professor of journalism, so maybe you're a little bit uniquely qualified to talk about this. It appears from the outside that the media has become more an advocacy proposition than a reporting proposition. And as you said, you can choose your channel and choose the ideology, and it's not really straight news you're always getting. So is that a fixable situation?
Look, part of the problem is that reporting is expensive, right? Blabbering your opinion, whether it's in print or on radio or TV, is cheap, right? And when you're talking about publications for whom the business model has collapsed, right? Because young people don't subscribe to newspapers, and the advertising revenue is all being gobbled up by Google and Facebook. It's not going to the publications themselves. So the number of publications that have, now there's some nonprofit efforts, there's some monies that some places that have gotten some venture capital money, but it's not clear that it's going to be sustainable. So that's part of the problem, right? Is that what we need is, if you want people to agree on the facts, there has to be people who gather the facts, right? I think this is a particularly worrisome problem at the local and state level, which is to say, it is local newspapers and local radio and TV that keeps mayors and state legislatures and city councils honest and prevents us from going to the kind of mass corruption we had at the state level in the late 19th century. And those institutions are dying. So that's part of the problem. The second problem is that if you are trying to create a business model, it doesn't really make a lot of sense these days to try to create a business model in which you're appealing across the waterfront. Again, if you were Walter Cronkite, that did make sense, right? Because there were not a lot of competition. So you want to appeal to everyone. But today, in such a crowded landscape, you basically you tailor things very specifically. It's not only true in politics, right? I mean, I remember when I was a kid, forgive me, some of you are probably going to shut off right now, but I'm a New England Patriots fan. So, and so, what I used to do is I used to scour the newspaper, reading everything about the NFL, and I would get one little thing about the New England Patriots. Now, I just get New England. I don't even have to pay attention to any other teams, right? I can get, so this is the micro folk, streaming that we're getting, and it happens ideological ways as well. And if this is, I think, what creates these kind of incentives. It's interesting, if you look at the Republican, if you look at Democratic media, if you look at Republican or conservative media that was anti-Trump, right? The Weekly Standard stayed anti-Trump. It's out of business, right? Glenn Beck, if you listen to Glenn Beck in 2016, he was about as anti-Trump as anybody. Now he's a big Trump fan, right? Because he realized that basically you can't sustain an institution if it's running up against the feelings, the opinions of the base, and that's what these media institutions are facing.
So, is there a way to get back to let me use a word that it's not being used in the question I'm looking at, but principled way of looking at not just reporting the news, but for people like me, for example, to think about politics.
Yeah.
And to kind of force politicians back into the mode of being more principled leaders, as opposed to kind of, I hate to use this term flip-flop, but and my complication of this question is going to be, what does our education system have to do with all of that? And I asked you a really complicated question.
Yeah. I mean, it's difficult. We are naturally, human beings are naturally tribal. I mean, again, not to get too macro, but if you think about the prehistory of humanity, right? What did it take to survive when you were part of a small band of people, right? If you went against your group, right, you were not likely to survive, right? So we are very naturally programmed to want community and to be very responsive to its needs and its views and its biases. And again, I talked about sports, right? I mean, sports teams, in some ways, the most irrational affiliation you can possibly have, right? It's not even like the New England Patriots are populated people from my hometown of Boston. They're just people happen to be passing through, but still, they lose and I go into a depression, right? People burn cars because of when their teams lose, right? They riot, right? So then you add this to politics, where there are things at stake. I think that one of the really important things is that people have other communities, other tribes, which are not the same as their political tribe, right? Which is that if you go to a church or a bowling club or your kid's soccer team or your kid's school or your neighborhood or whatever, and you have another affiliation, which you also care about a lot, but gives you something in common with people who you may disagree with politically, that I think helps to balance things a little bit and allows you to see the humanity in other things. If you're just sitting and, again, part of the problem, and COVID has made it worse, is people just sitting at their computer screens, right? Just getting this and being riled up. I think that we all need to make conscious efforts to have allegiances which are not, and communities which are not the same as our political allegiances and our political communities.
Interesting. More diversity.
Yes, and more life outside of politics.
Yeah. Question just popped up, which I think is interesting in today's day and age, right? We've talked about a little bit about demographics. You mentioned younger folks and their proclivities, and older people and their proclivities. But given what we know, how is it that we've ended up with baby boomers being our candidates in the last couple of elections? Where is Gen X? What's happening there?
I have a theory about this. I actually wrote a piece in The Atlantic about Gen X, why Gen X may never produce a president, right? Because again, even if it wasn't Biden, it could have been Bernie, it could have been Elizabeth Warren, right? I think one of the things that happened is a few years ago, roughly around 2016, the identity of both of the parties shifted pretty substantially, right? You think about 2016, Bernie Sanders emerges and moves the Democratic Party sharply to the left. Donald Trump emerges and moves the Republican Party sharply in a kind of nationalistic, anti-globalization, anti-trade. So you think about the trajectories of a lot of these Gen X politicians. A lot of them start to get elected in the first decade of the 20th century, when the identities of the two parties are different. So a lot of the Democrats, think about someone like Cory Booker, right? Cory Booker was a big rising star at a time when the Democratic Party was much more Clintonian, right? He was he was close to Wall Street. He supported charter schools, right? He took a lot of positions that were mainstream Democratic positions. And then what happens? The party moves substantially left, and he's caught essentially on the wrong side of that. Similarly with someone like Marco Rubio, right? Marco Rubio emerges, he's a pretty pro-immigration Republican at a time when that's a pretty accepted position. The Republican Party shifts radically, and then all of a sudden Rubio ends up losing the Republican nomination, in part because he's on the wrong side of that immigration issue. People don't forgive him for supporting the immigration reform. So I think one of the things that screws up a lot of these Gen X politicians is the party shift, and then they have taken a bunch of positions which are no longer popular. So I think that's part of the way of understanding it.
Okay, interesting. I want to talk a little bit about foreign policy, blended a little bit with economics, because I know that's one of your areas of expertise. The metals industry has a base that requires customers in North America, right? Manufacturing. And China has, through its various policies, since probably at least 20 years ago, been able to pull manufacturing out of the US into China. It's also going to other places globally. This offshoring of the manufacturing base of the US is important to this industry, but in a way it's also important to the nation, because it does become at some point a national security issue. When you were talking, you mentioned that a little bit.
Right.
Where does that ultimately lead? Not even so much assuming a Trump win or a Biden win, but internationally,
right?
Are other nations starting to pay attention to this, and where do they start to fall on the spectrum of China's a problem or China's a partner?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And I think, we probably have passed the moment of peak globalization, by which I mean the period at which basically governments were willing to let businesses say, wherever you can produce something the most cheaply in the supply chain, is fine. I think that we've clearly, Trump has moved away from that, but I think you see other countries moving away from that as well. I think what Biden is probably more likely to do is to say, how do we ally with other countries that we feel like are willing to play by the rules, and not coincidentally, also tend to be our geopolitical allies and partners, Europeans, maybe, South Korea, Taiwan, and basically leverage that at the WTO or wherever to pressure China to play by the rules, more in terms of what it's doing. Trump has, although he's focused a lot on China, in reality, he's had a more scattershot approach, right? Where he's been essentially levied tariffs against lots of different countries at various different points. I think that, we also face a moment in which China's role in the global economy is shifting. China is not the low-cost producer than it is. I mean, China is beginning to face some of the same challenges that the US is facing, which is to say that they are now being undercut by lower cost production in a lot of places. And they're trying to move up the chain, right? They want to be producing iPhones, right? I mean, that China, and we're already seeing that China is now competing with the United States in a much more kind of high-end production of than they were before. So this is all, without even thinking about the potential for some kind of geopolitical conflict, military conflict that could have massive economic consequences, right? So, I mean, one of the issues that doesn't get talked a ton about in American politics, but I think if you were looking at this, America and the world from a macro perspective, in terms that you would be paying more attention, is Taiwan, right? I mean, the more powerful China gets, the more likely it is that China will, in some form or another, basically move to take control of Taiwan. It might not be through an invasion, it could be through some kind of sanctions or economic embargo, but just look at the United States, what happened in the United States. The United States really starts to become much more powerful economically after the Civil War into the late 19th century. And the United States, which had always been a country which thought it had no interest in an overseas empire, it actually starts in the middle of the 19th century to start taking over islands in the Pacific and in the Caribbean. In the late 19th century, then it takes over Spain and Cuba, Philippines and Cuba and Puerto Rico. So China is likely naturally going to expand. The US is doubling down on its backing for Taiwan. So that would be a moment that could all of a sudden sever the US-China relationship in even really more dramatic ways. I think that we are probably moving towards environments in which supply chains, my guess, will be less globalized. The question is, are they just national, or do we have new geopolitical constellations? And what do those geopolitical constellations ultimately look like?
Yeah, interesting question. Who knows, right?
Right.
One last question, because we're running out of time, but I'd hate to let you get away without talking about the economy for just a second. Two questions. You mentioned one of them, but do you think we'll get a new stimulus out of Congress and the president before the election? And question two, which is sort of related, but maybe not, is infrastructure.
Yeah.
And there is a real need in this nation to improve and enhance and maintain our infrastructure.
Yes.
What's the chance that we get something to happen there?
I mean, the chances of a stimulus, let alone infrastructure, between now and the next presidency seems pretty slim. I mean, Pelosi, I think, and the Republicans in Congress are still negotiating, but they've been far apart on money, and their Democrats have wanted stuff about the elections in there that Trump has said he's absolutely not going to go for. I do think that if Biden were to win, I think a big infrastructure plan would be very likely something he would support. I think you could make an argument that Trump made a mistake by never pushing forward with a big infrastructure plan, in the sense that it could have been something that a lot of Democrats supported. There is a lot of bipartisan support. Now, to be fair, Biden's infrastructure will come with a lot of incentives / requirements, regulations on the environmental side that may make it, and requirements about union labor and about minority contracting, a lot of stuff that may make it less appealing to some conservatives. But I still think that an infrastructure plan would be likely a big part of the Biden agenda. And I think you're right. I think there's a consensus among people across the ideological spectrum that the US really needs it. I mean, we have really falling behind in terms of very, very critical infrastructures, whether it's it's 5G or artificial intelligence, about all of this stuff. And, I think regardless of your view on China, I think there should be a consensus in the United States that it's probably not a great idea to let them get way, way out ahead of us in some of this stuff. So I think that's something Biden is going to do. I hope it would be something that Trump would do if he gets a second term.
Okay. That's heartening. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
And let's end it on that positive note, so that we don't. Yeah. So Peter, thank you for your time today. I want to also thank everyone who's attending. Thanks for being here. If you have any questions, contact me. When you leave the webinar today, a question is going to pop up and ask you to complete our post-webinar survey. We'd really like you to do that. So that we can get better at doing this. We like content suggestions, we like technology suggestions. Anything that you can do to help us would be great. We rely on that feedback, so please do that. Next week we have another webinar. It's on Thursday, October 2nd, and that is back to business, so to speak. It's about agility and discernment in this new era of abnormal and change. So please join us for that session. Peter Beinart, thank you again for being here today, and thanks everyone for joining us. Have a safe day and stay well, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Peter.